Good morning. It is Sunday, May the 15th. Thank God it's Sunday. And this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So this today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare and the Pledge of Allegiance and Star-Spangled Banner, we will have gun violence, no free lunch, the last chapter of The Collapse of Parenting, and Hondo, Chapter 4. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for May the 15th. I've removed desolation from your bloodline. You are my beloved, and no longer will you be called deserted, or your life be called a place of desolation. You will be called my delight, for I have a covenant with you in an everlasting bond. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will I rejoice over you. As I did for my children in the wilderness, so I will split the rocks in your wilderness and give you water to drink as abundant as the seas. I will bring streams of my living water out of the rocky crags in your desert places, and will make water flow down like rivers for you and your generations. I will bring you out of desolation, and my son will shepherd you and lead you with skillful hands, just as my servant David tended his sheep. Isaiah 62:4-5, Psalms 78, 15-16, and 70-72. Prayer declaration. No longer will desolation and dryness cause me to dwell in a spiritual wilderness. For God has made all the wilderness places like Eden, and my desert places like the garden of the Lord. Let every desolation in my life or bloodline be raised up in the name of Jesus. Revive me and repair every desolation in my life. Amen. And so I do the daily declaration for spiritual warfare because it is about biblical verses and sayings that beat the devil. Again, we talk. There's a lot of talk in church about Jesus Christ and about God, and very, 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 very little talk about the devil. And I think that's done for secular reasons, to please secular interests, and that's too bad, because when you put the devil in the equation, everything makes sense. Ultimately, what we had today and yesterday in terms of the shootings in California and New York, especially in California, was the work of the devil. And if people went to church, spent more time in church, then we would have less gun violence, let's put it that way, especially gun violence of the natures that we've seen today and yesterday. People don't go to church because they're discouraged from going to church by the left, by Nancy Pelosi, by Chuck Schumer, and by other Democrat leaders. And so those are people that have a lot to answer for. They need to be explaining to Americans why it is that they're anti-faith, anti-Christian, and allowing, in essence, this type of violent activity to go on. But again, the point is that you put the devil in the equation, everything that goes on in the world makes sense. You have God fighting the devil, and that for the time being, the devil's going to score some victories. You've got the war in Ukraine, you've got the violence that we've had today and yesterday as examples of that. But that in the end, God will triumph, and we will have peace on earth. Back in a minute.
Stand
Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded and asks why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number one, a constitutional amendment banning abortion throughout the country. Number two, make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number three, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number four, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liability to all government regulators. Number five, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number six, the immediate repeal of all dictator laws. Number seven, the reinstatement of writs of outlawry. Number eight, government-sponsored recalls, ballot initiatives, and referendums. Number nine, a flexible minimum wage. Number 10, means-tested health care. And number 11, the immediate and permanent prohibition of investment banking by any office holder. Back in a minute. Thank you. So, true conservative-wise, there's two killings. There's today in a church in Laguna Niguel, Southern California. Apparently, a gunman got into the church, shot and killed somebody, wounded several others. But the church members tackled this guy and then hogtied him and held him for authorities. Otherwise, more people would have been killed. And there was of course, what happened in New York where a white guy traveled 200 miles to Buffalo to go to a store that's frequented apparently by mainly African Americans and opened fire and killing 8 to 10 people. So, and who's been arraigned for murder and hate crimes charges and stuff. So what I think is going to be interesting to see how Republicans deal with this. So how do they deal with mass shootings? They should be dealing with mass shootings the same way, roughly the same way that the Democrats are doing it, and by saying that gun violence has got to stop. But it is the rhetoric from the left that is creating this gun violence. It is Nancy Pelosi. It is the other AOC and others on the left that promote gun violence with their words, their deeds, their actions, sometimes in some cases inactions, like the events that happened in Portland, in Seattle, and other places across the country where there was riots, violence, where people were trying to burn up police stations with people inside. It is that kind of mindset that creates the problems that we're seeing today. Also, it does not help that we have in L.A., Laguna Niguel is in Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County has one of the weakest district attorneys. So it's open season in Los Angeles County. Every criminal in Southern California and probably across the states knows that if you want to commit a crime and have a very low risk of ending up, number one, getting bail, and number two, end up going and doing any long time, any serious time, you come to L.A. You come to Los Angeles County, you commit your crimes in L.A. County, and you know that you're probably going to, for all intents and purposes, get away with it. And in New York, it seems that there's, I don't know about Buffalo, but I know in the city of New York and city and county there that they also have a weak district attorney. And if the people in the legislature in New York are weak on crime, you're sending a signal to all the criminals. Now, having said that, that's what we need to be talking about tomorrow. I want to see what it is that Hugh-Hewitt and all the other right-wing talk show hosts are going to be talking about. I think that they're going to be on the defensive. I think that they're going to do what they always do, which is say, okay, this is terrible and horrible and awful, and there'll be call for prayers for the victims. But it'll be basically, don't touch our guns. And it's a weak way to do things. If we keep doing things via gun violence the way we've been doing them, it's not a question of if law-abiding citizens will have their guns taken away from them. It'll be a question of when. Republicans and conservatives have to come up with a better answer than what they've been coming up with. And one of them is to come out and say, place the blame where it belongs. This is the fault of the left. This is the fault of Nancy Pelosi. This is the fault of Chuck Schumer. This is the fault of all of those people. Number one, that we're saying defund the police and trying to get weak district attorneys appointed, but also for encouraging violence, for trying to create friction, particularly friction between whites and blacks. And this is another occasion where Republican blacks can stand up and be the civil rights leaders that they should be. It is Republican blacks that should be the civil rights leaders and should be recognized as civil rights leaders. Again, in L.A., we had a guy named Hutchinson that had a press conference talking about how unacceptable this is, that there's some kind of gun violence legislation stuck in Congress somewhere, and those are the people that are the only ones that get heard on the issue of gun violence, and that's crap. Republicans have a vested interest in reducing gun violence just the same way Democrats do. So it's time for Republicans to stand up and say, we're as much or more against gun violence than the left, because we're not out promoting violence. We're not out promoting social friction. We're not out promoting revolution, which is what this guy in New York was doing. That was what it was all about. Go to Buffalo, shoot black people as a white guy in an effort to create the kind of disharmony, the kind of riots and whatnot across the country that we saw when during the deaths of several black men at the hands of police. Now, we haven't seen it so far. BLM seems to be fairly silent. The only thing I've seen in reaction is Mr. Hutchinson having a press conference. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of activism so far. So anyways, but it is, again, Republican blacks. Republicans party is the party of civil rights, and Republican black people are therefore the civil rights leaders, true civil rights leaders in this country. It's time for them to stand up and accept that mantle and take the lead. Herschel Walker is a classic example. He's running for Senate in Georgia. This is a prime opportunity for Mr. Herschel Walker to stand up, take the lead on civil rights, hold a press conference, and talk about gun violence, and demand that Nancy Pelosi apologize and that she put in place policies that will discourage the promotion of violence on the left, that she herself should be discouraging violence, that the other people on the left discourage other people on the left from from encouraging others to be violent, encouraging revolution, etc. So this is, again, an opportunity for Republicans, particularly Republican blacks, to stand up and challenge the left for the title of the Party of Civil Rights. Because if you don't do that, there's no way to win. There's no way to win on the civil rights issues. There's no way to look forward to having more black people in the Republican Party unless you challenge the Democrat Party for the title of the Party of Civil Rights. And then what we do then is we define civil rights leadership the way it should be defined, not the way the left defines it, which is basically just Marxism with a black face, but we define it in terms of freedom and in terms of conservatism. That civil rights means being conservative. So it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow. I know what they should do, but I don't think we're going to get the proper response out of the right-wing talk show hosts tomorrow, but we'll see. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. Quote, as government regulates business more, that favors corporations large enough to have substantial legal and compliance departments. Regulation serves as a kind of fixed cost of doing business, discouraging market entry. Not only do higher rates of regulatory growth correlate with increase in market concentration ratios, but the period during which regulation increased significantly, 1990 to 2000, was followed by increases in market concentration. None of those correlations proved causality, but at the very least it is possible that government regulation is a major force behind the rise of market power, unquote. Tyler Cowen. Regulation is a subsidy. There's no more cronyist tool in human history than that of regulation. It favors the already big and discourages, if not pulverizes, the aspirational. And that was There's No Free Lunch. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the conclusion of the collapse of parenting, and then I'll have some commentary after this chapter. You and I are not the only ones trying to raise kids right in a culture that is likely to steer them wrong. I've met like-minded parents across the United States and around the world. Together, you and I and other parents like us can create a community of parents who understand the challenges, who are trying to build a culture of respect that works in the context of the 21st century. We need to reevaluate our values. 50 years ago, our popular culture celebrated the lives of ordinary people in television shows like I Love Lucy, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and The Andy Griffith Show. The characters depicted in those shows were not famous or wealthy, but they were good role models for children because they were good people. Today, popular American culture, especially the culture of children and teenagers, celebrates famous entertainers or would-be entertainers in shows like iCarly, The X Factor, So You Think You Can Dance, The Voice, and American Idol. As journalist Alina Trujand recently observed, we parents end up convinced that being average will doom our children to a life that will fall far short of what we want for them. The very word ordinary has become a derogatory term. Brené Brown, a professor of social work, suggests that in 21st century America, an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life. We Americans have gone far astray in the past 3 decades with regard to understanding what kids need to become fulfilled and independent adults. We've undermined the authority of teachers and parents. We have allowed kids to be guided by same-age peers rather than insisting on the primacy of guidance from adults. As a result, American kids now grow up to be less imaginative, less adaptive, and less creative than they could be. But you can change that in your own home starting today. If you live in the United States and you want your child to grow up to be happy, productive, and fulfilled, then you will have to parent your children differently than many of your neighbors. Your neighbors may not understand. They may whisper to one another about how out of touch you are. You don't allow your 11-year-old son to play violent video games like Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty. He must feel so isolated. Your 12-year-old daughter is one of only 3 girls in her class who doesn't have her own smartphone, who doesn't have her own Instagram page. How awful. You will be so uncool. Don't be intimidated. Lend your neighbor your copy of this book. But meanwhile, you will have to be courageous for the sake of your child so that he or she can grow up to be brave and humble like you. Throughout the world, parents in developed countries are increasingly confused about their role. Should they be their child's best friend or their child's authoritative guide? Many parents are twisting themselves into knots, trying to be the cool peer one moment and the authoritative parent the next. My advice is don't do that. Your job is to be the authoritative parent, not the cool peer. The parent-child relationship differs from the relationship between same-age peers. Understand the differences. I found the advice to be very bit as necessary in Edinburgh, Auckland, and Brisbane as it is in Dallas, New York, and Seattle. But other challenges are uniquely American. In this book, I've highlighted 3. 1, culture. The culture of disrespect is mingled with the culture of live for now. When one sees the Pepsi Live for Now billboard in England or New Zealand, it's easy to recognize the message as an American import that anyone can freely accept or reject. But here in the United States, Live for Now is our national culture. It is the default culture of the American kids that encounter it if we set them loose to navigate on their own, as some notables would have us do. Without authoritative guidance, it is the culture that they will adopt as their own. And the keyword there is guidance. 2, medication. In the United States, it's become common to medicate children with powerful psychiatric drugs as a first rather than as a last resort. And that's due to something called determinism. Nobody's at fault. There's no bad guys. There's no good guys. There's just people that have problems, that have been forced to do things by powers beyond their control. Number 3, overscheduling. As I mentioned in Chapter 9, we Americans like to boast about how busy we are. The nonstop grind of school and activities and homework begins early in the morning and continues late into the night. That's not healthy. Find a different perspective. To be a wise parent in the United States today, you must understand these challenges. Be the authoritative guide. Introduce your child to a worldview more meaningful than live for now. Resist the pressures to medicate your child, except as a last resort rather than as the first intervention. Don't give in to the temptation to overschedule. Teach your child that spending relaxed time with family is more important than cramming 2 or 3 more extracurricular activities into the week. Every human relationship is characterized by responsibilities, but the responsibilities differ depending on the relationship. A physician has responsibilities to a patient, to evaluate the patient's signs and symptoms, to make a diagnosis, and to explain the treatment. A friend has responsibilities to a friend, to be kind, to be trustworthy, to be available to the best of her ability in times of need. A husband has responsibilities to his wife, and a wife to her husband. Each has made a commitment to cherish one another, forsaking all others lifelong. Now, he's missing something here. What he really means to say is loyalty. One of the words that we rarely use in this language anymore in America is loyalty. And we don't think of relationships in terms of loyalty, but that's exactly, every relationship is based on loyalty to one degree or another. Your relationship with your postman, there's a certain loyalty there, but not the same as it would be with one of your friends or with a relative, and certainly not with your spouse. But it's all based on loyalty. And we have gotten away from being loyal, and the key thing is to be neutral. And you can't be neutral, especially when it comes to raising your kids. There's no neutrality. You have to be loyal to them and expect them to be loyal to you. Each of these human connections between physician and patient, between friends and between husband and wife is vital. But there's no greater responsibility between human beings than that of a parent to a child. It is the parent's responsibility not only to feed, clothe, and shelter the child, but also to acculturate the child, to instill a sense of virtue and a longing for integrity, and to teach the meaning of life according to the parent's best understanding. And again, what he's missing here is church. What he's basically telling you to do is take your child to church. The live for now thing, you can dispel all that by simply taking your child to church. When you go to church, you learn about Jesus Christ, who is our Lord and Savior, and who was on the earth 2,000 years ago. So the child gets a sense that there is a time continuity, that there was things happening on this earth before he was born, and that there are going to be things happening on this earth long after he has died. So, go to church. Contemporary mainstream culture has undermined the authority of parents to do their job, and actually undermined the authority of everybody. Church elders, priests, teachers, etc. The result has been a collapse of parenting worldwide, perhaps more so in North America than elsewhere. The collapse of parenting has led, not surprisingly, to an explosion in anxiety and depression among children and teenagers, and to an extraordinary rise in the proportion of kids who are fragile in ways unknown to previous generations. For the sake of your child, you have to create an alternative culture in your home. You have to assert without apology the primacy of the parent-child relationship over relationships between same-age peers. And again, what he should have said was, you have to assert that the loyalty, family loyalties, come before friendship loyalties or loyalties to your friends. You have to teach that family comes first, despite living in a culture where family ties are seldom respected. You must teach your child that every choice he or she makes has an immediate, far-reaching, and unforeseen consequences. You must help your child to find meaning in life that is not about their latest accomplishment or how they look or how many friends they have, but about who your child is, their truest self. You must judge your success as a parent not by how many friends your child has, not by grade point average or test scores or athletic prowess, not by an acceptance letter from a famous college or university, but by whether your child is on the road to fulfillment, capable of governing his or her needs and desires instead of being governed by them. Do not allow yourself to be paralyzed by your own inadequacies. You may not be a perfect model of honesty and integrity. Neither am I. There may be dark places in your own soul, things that you are ashamed of. I have them too. You may feel silly trying to preach to your child about virtue and character because you know how far astray you have gone in the past, including the recent past. I have often felt the same way. But too bad. To borrow an analogy from the classroom, raising your child to know and care about virtue and character is not a special extra credit assignment reserved for the superior parent. It is mandatory for all parents. And when you're given a mandatory assignment, you must do your best regardless of your own shortcomings, regardless of whether your peers, other parents, are paying attention to the assignment or not. There's no greater responsibility. I wish you all the best for you and your child, and I hope we will be in touch. And that was the conclusion of the book, The Collapse. Let me get all the way back here. The Collapse of Parenting. There it is. The Collapse of Parenting, How We Hurt Our Kids When We Treat Them Like Grown-Ups. The 3 things you must do to help your child or teen become a fulfilled adult, by Leonard Sachs, MD, PhD, author of Boys Adrift and Girls on the Edge. And so, next time, and again, this has been an excellent book, but like I said, he misses a few things. One of them is about going to church. The other is the issue of loyalty that he misses. He doesn't quite. He's close, but he doesn't quite get there. It's loyalty is the issue. Loyalty to your parents, loyalty to other family members comes before loyalty to your school friends. That's what he was trying to get to with that. And again, if you want to, particularly to get rid of the culture of disrespect, you want to encourage a culture of respect, you have to do it by getting your kids, you yourself, to respect the rules in life, all of the rules. And one of the best places to do that, go to church. Church is an excellent place for humility. He's talking about having your child be more humble. And again, following the rules is humble. And the place to do that is church and school. Those are the places to be following the rules. So, and again, what he was talking about being an authoritative or authoritative person or something, what he should be saying is using your knowledge and your experience to give your child a boost, a head start, so to speak, so they don't have to learn the hard way. Parents today, according to Dr. Sachs, are letting their children learn the hard way, and that is so wrong. It's evil. Stop and think about it. Would you let a toddler stick his fingers in an electric light socket to find out that's something he shouldn't do? Would you let the toddler, purposely let a toddler or small child, maybe 5, 6-year-old, whatever, that can reach the stove, reach up and touch a hot stove and get burned just so they can learn not to do that? That's hideous. That's absolutely hideous. And I'll tell you what it leads to. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's been on, I guess it was on YouTube. Some guy where I worked showed it to me on his phone. He'd saved it. But it's a camera, a security camera at a train station. And it's one of these light rail trains that are electric. And so you see a bunch of people milling about outside, waiting to go in and get seated. And all of a sudden, from the left-hand side of the screen, you see appear a man walking on top of the train. Very casually, just walking along on top of the train. And you're thinking, what in the world is this bozo doing? What is he doing walking around on top of the train? And he moves from left to right. He gets a little past center, and he very casually reaches up and touches the wire above him. And the next thing that happened is so grotesque, so gruesome, it defies description. I wouldn't describe it to you even if I could. It was disgusting. But this is an example of somebody learning the hard way. Okay, instead of being taught, instead of having some responsible adult somewhere in his life telling him, you've got to respect electricity, because if you don't, electricity will burn you or kill you, and you'll end up dying in one of the most gruesome and disgusting ways possible, because that's what happened to him. He ends up dying, and it was absolutely awful. And for those of you that have seen this, you know what I'm talking about. But that's a situation where you're letting somebody learn by hitting every pothole in the road. That's just evil. That's all there is to it. You're not only a bad parent if you're letting your kids learn the hard way, you're a bad human being. And that brings me to the other point that Dr. Sachs missed, and that is peer pressure. It's not good enough to create your own little island of moral paradise, if you will. You have to promote it. That means when you have parents that come to your house and they want you to look the other direction while their kids get drunk, you pass judgment on them on the spot. You say, how dare you? What a disgusting parent you are. I don't want your child in my house. I don't want you on my property. And if I ever hear about your child getting drunk again, I'm going to call Child Protective Services and make sure that your child is put into foster care or put up for adoption. You have to do that. Okay, it's counter peer pressure. And that's the way that we're going to win on the right. That's the way conservatives are going to win. We have to get off the dime and start with the counter peer pressure. Okay, so anyways, yeah, that was the end of The Collapse of Parenting by Dr. Sachs. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. And so what do we got coming up here next? Let me see what's going on here. Let's do this, because there's another excellent, juicy book that I wanted to read. And here it is, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And I've been looking for a book like this. I did read one about Power Hungry, was what it was called. But that was just generally about power and whatnot, not what I was really looking for. This guy, Alex Epstein, has wrote a book for why it is that we should prefer to use gasoline, oil, natural gas, and coal. So that's what's going to be up next. And again, the way we should use this kind of promote fossil fuels is by saying this is what's environmentally sound. Electricity isn't environmentally sound. Using the sun isn't environmentally sound. It's using fossil fuels, everything that God has given us in abundance. Natural gas, oil. There's oil all over the place. When I was growing up in the 70s, everybody's talking about an energy shortage and that the energy crisis was going to make poor people of us all. We're all going to end up burned out and living hand to mouth, et cetera, et cetera. And bull. We find more and more and more reserves of oil. We find out that oil didn't come from dead dinosaurs. Wherever it did come from, it's amazing because it is everywhere. And so we got to be able to fight the left for the title of the party of the environment and use fossil fuels as the way to do it. How to do that? Well, might be a little bit of a challenge at first because you're used to looking at things one way, the left's way. The left has presented themselves as the experts on the environment. And that's why anybody who dares to come out and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't need electric vehicles, ends up getting sneered at and slandered and whatnot. We have to fight them for the title of the experts on the environment. We are the experts on the environment. What the left is saying is a bunch of hogwash. It's a bunch of superstition. And for the most part, that's exactly what the left is up to, is superstition. But again, next time is going to be the moral case for fossil fuels. And coming up next is chapter 3 of Hondo. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now it's going to be actually chapter 4 from the book Hondo. And it's an excellent book, again, a piece of Americana, cowboys and Indians, and it's also got a lot of good lessons about individualism, rugged individualism, and character. A lot to say about character. Chapter 4. No man knows the hour of his ending, nor can he choose the place or the manner of his going. To each it is given to die proudly, to die well, and this is, indeed, the final measure of the man. The 47 men in Company C rode with an awareness of death, for there were no recruits in their twin files. All were seasoned, desert-wise fighting men who knew the character and ability of their enemy. The mission allotted to Company C was a wide sweep of the basin to warn and to bring to camp, if possible, all ranchers, prospectors, trappers, and pioneer home builders who might still be at large and unaware of the impending outbreak of fresh hostilities. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Creighton C. Davis. At 32, Creighton Davis was a case-hardened veteran, graduated from the Point in time to serve the last year of the war between the states. He had transferred west following the war and timed to ride with Carpenter to the relief of Forsyth at Beecher's Island. Later, he was at the destruction of Tall Bull's villages in 1969. In the 5 succeeding years, he had campaigned in the desert, working from a series of bleak, windswept, sun-baked posts against the Apaches, that fiercest and wiliest of guerrilla fighter. Squinting his eyes against the sun glare, he tried to penetrate the shimmering heat waves. Beyond the heat waves were the mountains, and from the liquid movement for them arose the sentinel spires of the saguaro, those weird exclamation points of the desert. No sound disturbed the fading afternoon, no sound but the creak of saddle leather, the rattle of accoutrement, the click of hooves on stone, and these were always with them. Sweat trickled through the dust on his face, and alkali had made his uniform stiff and gray. His neck itched from the heat and dust, and his skin was raw from the baking sun. Nowhere in all that vast expanse was there movement. Yet out there somewhere was the Apache. When he saw the solitary rider sitting motionless against the background of the hill, he almost drew rein. Cotton Linden was a square-built man of 40, his face so seamed and lined with desert years that he looked 20 years older. The nickname was born of his hair, once corn yellow, now pure white, and his once apparent vanity. He swung his horse alongside the lieutenant's. He indicated the direction in which they rode. Water yonder. What do you think? They're around. I don't know where. See anything of Lane? Won't. Not until he wants you to. The general expects him. He's overdue. Lyndon tilted his hat against the sun. He'll make out. There was a slight change in his voice. Hope you and me do as well. Davis glanced aside at Lyndon, a quick frown shadowing his eyes. Coming from Lyndon, it sounded ominous. Davis knew enough of such men to realize they often knew things without being able to explain why they knew them. It was, he supposed, a result of some subconscious perception. As if in answer to his thoughts, Lyndon added, That's Vittoro out there. Davis let his horse walk on a dozen steps, then turned in his saddle. Sergeant Breen, there's water ahead. We'll make camp. Breen involuntarily glanced at the sun. 2 good hours of riding left, and Davis was not a man to waste time on a trail. We may not find more water, and I want the men to rest, Davis said. A bad day tomorrow. He felt an immediate satisfaction with the spot. The water was a small stream, clear and cold, that flowed from the mouth of an arroyo scarcely 50 yards deep. At the head of the arroyo, the spring flowed down from a dozen cracks in the rock. The spot selected for the camp was in a basin under shelving rock, and about 20 yards out from the face, the ground sloped away, offering a fine field of fire. The camp was masked from the wide plain by a ridge of volcanic rock several hundred yards off. It was a sudden relief from the saddle, and the men relaxed quickly, getting their horses out and mounting guard at once. Old Pete Britton, who had just joined as a scout, went atop the cliff for a look around. There was a little talking, the men bathing, filling canteens, and taking the unexpected rest. The sun declined, the shadows reached out from the cliff, faint smoke lifted from the few fires. Lieutenant Davis walked alone to the edge of the hill, and with his glass studied the volcanic ridge, then the plain. He saw nothing. He had the feeling now himself. Despite that, there was a solid confidence within him. If they had to face serious trouble, he could not face it with a better company of men. Sergeant Breen had a record of 20 years of service, and he had been in the Southwest when Mangus, Colorado was active, and Cochise. After that, he had seen service at Bull Run, Shiloh, and the Wilderness. Corporal Owen Patton had ridden with Nathan Bedford Forrest and had been a lieutenant himself. He was a tall, rangy young man with a blonde hair that waved back from his brow. He was the best shot in the company and one of the finest horsemen. O'Brien had been seen a freighter before he joined up, veteran of many Indian battles. Silvers and Shoemaker had been buffalo hunters. The faint smoky haze of evening lay over the desert, and the clouds were tinged with the rose of the setting sun. Davis stopped by the spring, drank of the cold water, then walked back to where his bedroll was dumped against the cliff's face. He threw his campaign hat aside and sat down, digging writing materials from his saddlebags. Lyndon opened his eyes and watched him. It was the first time he'd ever seen Davis riding on patrol. Sergeant Breen noticed it too, and looking quickly at Lyndon. No courier was being sent back. The command would return in just 2 days, if it returned. Breen checked the guards and added a word of warning, then returned to camp. Lyndon was lighting his pipe. Too quiet out there, Lyndon said. I wish Pete would get back. Coming now. Pete Britton had lived 50 hard years, 40 of them in Indian country. He did not stop, nor did he look toward Lyndon and Breen, but walked on by to where Davis sat. Davis glanced up. Yes? No use to ride by the McLaughlins. Davis felt something inside him go sick and empty. He'd liked the McLaughlins. He sat at meals with them more than a dozen times. 3 stalwart men and 2 women, 4 youngsters. You sure? Pete Britton's irritation sounded in his reply. Sure? I'm mighty sure. He jerked his head to the north. Smoke, too much for a small fire. That barn and house, most like. Sometime this afternoon. Lieutenant Creighton C. Davis sat very still, the trial of command before him. If he moved out now, 1 or more might still be alive. He might effect a rescue. On the other hand, he would be riding off into darkness with tired men against a relentless and ruthless enemy that would know he was coming. And if they were gone, the tracks could not be followed before daybreak. If he let out his command and men were lost, he would be asked why. If he did not lead them out and some of the family could be saved, he would also be asked why. He sat very still, then said quickly, "Thanks, Pete. Anything more you can tell me?" Pete Britton shook his head. "Daylight, maybe." The old man turned and walked away to join Breen and Lyndon, who had listened. Britton jerked his head. "Ain't no fool. I feared he wanted to go traipsing after them in the dark." Breen shook out of his bed and pulled off his boots. He sat for a minute, looking off toward the first faint stars. Then he rolled in his blankets. When he finally dropped off to sleep, he could still hear the faint scratching of the lieutenant's pen. In the first clear light of the dawn, Davis stood over the campfire with a cup of coffee. He glanced around for Britton. "Pulled out before sunup," Lyndon said. Horses were led out and saddled and mounted, and the company moved out. Dusk lifted. Sun glinted on rifles. Davis swung his horse onto the trail toward the McLaughlins. Lieutenant Davis did not doubt that Britton had been correct, but it was his duty to check and to bury the bodies if they were to be found. It was, he reflected, no pleasant task for such an early morning. With the lift of his hand, Cotton Lyndon moved out to the flank and angled up the slope. Davis watched him, frowning slightly, then turned in his saddle. "Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "We're riding into trouble. I don't know where it will come from or when. Pass the word along. No lounging in the saddle. No carelessness. I want every man alert. This is no routine patrol." Breen dropped back, and Davis let his eyes go again to Lyndon. The man was riding quietly, keeping his mount to the crest of the ridge, and in such a position that he could see over without exposing more than his hat and eyes. Dust climbed. The sun grew warm. Through a notch in the trees, Davis saw a fleck of bright green. That would be the cottonwoods at the McLaughlin ranch. As they came out of the draw into the wide valley, all was still in the morning sun. Where the ranch house had stood, they could see blackened ruins and a slow lift of smoke. Davis tightened his lips. His eyes swung around the valley. "Sergeant?" When Breen moved up, he said quickly, "As we move in, I want a perimeter defense. Detail a burial party. There'll be bodies down there. Have Corporal Patton take 6 men and sweep those woods." "You think they're still there, sir?" Breen was dubious. "It ain't like them, sir." "They're Apaches, Breen." "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Breen dropped back. The lieutenant was right, of course. There was no telling what an Apache might do, except that it would be the most unexpected thing. Breen had heard it said that Davis was too careful. With Apaches, a man could not be too careful. The company moved into the ranch yard and swung down. The bodies were there. After a quick glance, Lieutenant Davis turned aside. McLaughlin, his 2 sons, and the women. They had all died here. It was better than being prisoners, except, perhaps, for the children. The Apache, a cruel and vicious fighter, was kind to children, often adopted them into the tribes, and treated them gently. With women, it was otherwise. He glanced around. Patton was moving out with 6 men toward the small grove of trees. The burial party was working. Other men had moved out, and the perimeter defense was set up. Suddenly, Davis glanced around. There was no sign of Lyndon. Anxiously, he walked to the edge of the yard and glanced around the hills. No rider, no dust. Breen walked toward him, hat in hand, mopping his face. "Nasty job, sir. They're hacked up mighty bad." "How many you think?" "Maybe a dozen, not more than 20. Breen put on his hat. "Nothing we could have done, sir. It was earlier than Britton thought. Yesterday morning, I reckon." He indicated the corral. Horses didn't eat all the hay they were fed. Davis nodded. It fitted with what he himself observed. The Indians must have been waiting out there at daybreak, lying perfectly still, probably scattered around the ranch. McLaughlin had died at the corral, struck down by 3 arrows. Jim McLaughlin, the older of the boys, had evidently received some warning, for he had rushed to the door, gun in hand. There was a spot of blood at the barn that could mean a dead or wounded Indian. And Alex McLaughlin lay sprawled and dead with an overturned bucket beside him. "Must have been coming from the spring," Sergeant Breen said, and he saw something and yelled. Then they got him. Jim rushed to the door, and he stood him off a spell. One of the women had her hands blackened like she'd been firing that old muzzle loader. Davis tightened his lips. Corporal Patton stopped before him and saluted sharply. Woods clear, sir. Found where several Indians have bedded down, sir. Looks like they've remained some time. The burial party was returning, their faces gray and sick. All right, Sergeant, mount up. They were in their saddles and moving out when they saw the rider. A horse was coming down toward them at a dead run, and on the back was the bobbing figure of a man. It was Cotton Linden. But it was such a Cotton Linden as they had never seen. The proud white mane of hair was stained red with blood. Strips had been peeled from his hide. Blood streamed from his wounds and stained the sides of the paint pony on which he was tied. And that's the end of the first part of Chapter 4 of the book Hondo. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back Brian Suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back Brian Suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.